welcome. Thank you for coming. I saw Jurassic Park, like I mentioned, 29 years ago, and the same feeling I had 29 years ago that I had today, the feeling of wonder and amazement, and totally blown away. Part of what made today more special was a lot of our students who never saw it on the big screen got to see it with the big screen with their parents in the audience. So that was a really wonderful thing for us. But we're here, we're so glad to have the screenwriter here to help us crack the DNA code of Jurassic Park script. So please welcome UCSB Pollak Theater stage, David Koepp.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so you and I are of an age where we grew up watching Spielberg movies.
Yes.
Let's Duel, Jaws, Close Encounters, Raiders, E.T., we can name a lot more. How did you transition from being someone who was influenced him as a young child to collaborating with him on Jurassic Park?
Well, I was working at Universal at the time. I had started, my first couple of movies were indies, which we made sort of by hook or by crook, the way you do with indies. And I had written a script called Bad Influence that the guy who was the head of production at Universal at the time, Casey Silver, wanted to buy and thought it would make an interesting comedy, but I'd written it as a thriller. So I said, no, I'd rather not sell you that and turn it into a comedy. I'm going to see if I can make it as a thriller, but why don't you hire me and I'll write you a comedy. So he said, I like that kid, he's got moxie. So that's not how Casey talks, but it would be fun if he did. So I was working at Universal on a couple of year thing where they pay you a little money and you give them tell them ideas and write scripts and hope all goes well. And one of those was Death Becomes Her, which Bob Zemeckis was shooting at the time. So I sort of came to Spielberg's attention, and he'd been was looking for someone to work on Jurassic because they'd had a few tries and it wasn't working out. So he wanted somebody new, and I think part of the appeal was I was new, he'd never heard of me, and I was probably cheap. So if I failed quickly, it wouldn't really cost anything, and he could move on. But happily, it worked out. But the point you make is a good one, which is, those formative years when I think our aesthetic tastes are formed from, in my case, like 14 to 24. Whatever you see in that range, whatever you listen to, whoever you read, that's going to dictate what your tastes are for the rest of your life, I think. Or was in my case. So from my 14 to 24, I was seeing Jaws, Close Encounters, Raiders, E.T., and there's no way I could not have been influenced by him. And so to be then, not that long later, collaborating was daunting, and I had to try very hard not to be a sycophant or pitch things that I thought he would like. Yeah. Certainly I wanted him to like them, but I had to keep reminding myself I was there because he felt, rightly or wrongly, that my opinions had some validity. So it was hard to say, yeah, sure, I'm a total peer of this guy. Because I made Apartment Zero, so, surely.
So we'll talk a little about the scope. So the book was a little more the big concern in the book was the dinosaurs getting off the island, where the original book, but the movie was a little more small group trying to survive. What led to your decision to kind of shift the focus away from, the whole larger story in the book to more of just keep it isolated?
Books are just too big. I've adapted a number of books, and the problem is always the same. You have sometimes 400 pages of stuff and characters and all the time in the world to digress and go into people's thoughts and feelings and all the things you can't do in movies. It's kind of a miracle to me that movies get made from books at all, because they're just such different media. They're stories, though, so you've got a story, but more importantly, characters. So hopefully you pick up a few good characters, which I think we did from the book, although we felt free to mess around with them a bit. And then see like how much of this book story can I use and where do I need to make up my own stuff. So it's just, the world is too big and also we had to take into account the fact that these effects had to be invented in order to make the movie. So they're really quite limited by today's standards. There aren't very many effect shots in this movie. I don't remember the exact number, but it's under 100. Which, today 1,200 is not uncommon. And there was no guarantee that would work at all. So you have to choose to focus on the people and will they survive, because if you just do a movie about dinosaurs, it's impossible, or was.
Yeah, I remember Laura Dern mentioned in an interview, she was just like staring at a cardboard box with an X on it.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing goes on to this day. You know, one of my favorite moments on the set was watching Jeff Goldblum run from a guy who had a 10-foot stick with a cardboard T-Rex head on it. And Jeff said, it would help a bit if you'd roar, if you could, just a bit of roaring. So the guy did, and Jeff said, of course, that was a joke. I'll scream, that'll be what I do, and you just chase me. Kind of funny.
Well, the story deals with the man playing God in the pursuit of scientific discovery, you know, but also for profit. A little bit of a Frankenstein thing going on there.
Sure. Plenty of Frankenstein.
Yeah. When structuring the script, how did you approach balancing? Like, you had to put all the scientific elements, but you didn't want it to kind of weigh down your thematic core story.
The science was really fun. That was part of the, part of the appeal of it, was that Michael Crichton had come up with this, once in a lifetime genius idea. Actually, he had a few in his, but for anybody else, that would be a once in a lifetime genius idea. Because it's so plausible that the DNA is preserved. Mosquitoes bite the thing, the mosquito's preserved, the DNA is therefore preserved. That's just great. And if you sign off on something that's fairly easily explainable as an audience member, then you're just along with the story. And it was just a great idea. And he had all the science to back it up. So we just had to figure out, how do we express our science? We can't go on for 5 or 6 pages the way he does. And I remember, I think Steven and I were talking and said, almost as a joke, what if it was just an animated sequence? Or maybe he wasn't kidding, but I laughed first, and then I said, oh, you're serious. And I can't remember. But because it's a theme park and they have to explain it to, visitors, it makes sense that there'd be a thing. So let's do it in the spirit of, in our case, Hemo the Magnificent, which was this movie about blood that you used to see in 7th grade health class back in the day. So it was always looking for what's the easy and what's slightly cinematic way to explain this stuff. And then I'd been so daunted by the Malcolm character in the book, I wanted to cut him because it was just too much work to figure out how to get all this guy's ideas into the movie. And Steven said, yeah, but Goldblum came in and read some from the book, and it was so good. Can't you make it work? So I figured.
Yeah, math and chaos theory is not exactly the most visually easy thing to transform.
Heavens no.
Well, let's look at Alan Grant, Sam Neill's character. He's, protagonist. While he's a paleontologist who develops a healthy fear of dinosaurs, he's more afraid of kids at the beginning.
Yeah.
What was your approach to taking him from the book version of the character into turning him into this character?
Something happens when in the book, it doesn't matter if he's not really if he has any kind of personal issue that he's thinking or feeling. He can talk about the science and about the dinosaurs for the entire book, and your attention is held, and it's fine. Movies are different because you're looking at someone's face, and you have to have some sort of emotional investment in them. You just do, or if you want your movie to be good. Movies work best when our emotions are engaged. So he had to have a personal issue, and that's what we came up with.
I like the opening with him when he terrifies the kid with the raptor.
He seems to take a little perverse pleasure in that several times during the film.
But it was also a good way to set up the raptors.
Yeah.
So it was.
Yes, and if you think if you watch a description of a scene like that in Act 1 and you don't think that's coming back in Act 3, you're just not, you're not playing along.
All right, Ellie Sattler is a badass paleobotanist doing everything from leading a rescue mission to reaching into dino poop to solve the mystery of the sick dinosaur. At the time, young female audiences were impacted because they didn't see a lot of women on the big screen from the STEM sciences. The characters. She was not a damsel in distress, but she was in charge. What was the process of kind of creating her into this kind of very interesting, unique character?
Well, thankfully, she was there in the book. So again, credit must be given to Crichton. But I ran with it, she was a terrific character, and there was no reason. There are still a preponderance of men in the movie, and it's 30 years ago now, so but I think we did okay in terms of that. I remember getting someone complaining. This was before online, so I must have gotten a letter from somebody that had found the screenplay and read it and said, "Why is Grant's character in dialogue referred to as Grant, and Dr. Sattler's character is referred to as Ellie?" And I wrote back and said, "I have no excuse," and I haven't done that again since. It's that thing of men are men and women are girls. That's not what I believe. I'm saying that is the old way of thinking and approaching things. So while we were all evolving, we all have a ways to go.
Now Hammond was a kind of a big departure from the book in a lot of ways.
The book was just a downer in many ways, in that I think almost everybody dies, and we had there's a certain body count that we were comfortable with and a certain body count we weren't, and a darkness of tone that Steven later that year would go on to make a hopeful movie about the Holocaust. So this is a guy who sees hope in the world, and so to have Hammond be quite so diabolical and suffer a horrible ending just wasn't something either one of us were interested in.
Well, that's always interesting. The scene where he meets Alan and Ellie, he loved science and he loved what they did, but he still had that corporate greed side of him, and or to play God. So it was interesting, much more dynamic of a villain instead of like the 1980s cartoon CEO villain.
Yeah, who were always German in the 80s. Yeah, I think Steven preferred the Walt Disney model to what was in the book. Walt Disney himself, the man.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you, Steven, recognize the irony that that you created a movie that became commercialized and now has an awesome water ride and Jurassic Park thing?
Well, yeah, and at the time, there's a very self-aware shot in the gift shop or in the restaurant that sort of pans lovingly off the merchandise that would then later go on and be sold. And I remember saying, as I was writing it, I'm writing this movie about greedy theme park people, and I'm writing it for greedy theme park people. And then it has gone on to be part of a theme park, but that's all that's a snake eating its own tail. That's okay. No one was injured.
So, because we have a lot of screenwriting students in the audience, so when you're adapting a book, what is your first step? Is it you map out the scenes you want, or what's your first step in kind of figuring out your structure?
Read it. But I'm not kidding. Read it as you would read for pleasure, and see if you get pleasure. And if your ideas, it's the same for me with a book or an original. Movies it's very binary. There's a 1 or a 0 in my head. I'm either swimming with possibilities and, wouldn't this be fun, and I have another idea, or there's nothing. And I'm like, that could be cool, but I don't see it. And you have to be super honest about that. My friend Steven Soderbergh says there are only 2 answers as to, do I want to do a movie? And that is either no or hell yes. But there can be nothing in between. And I've always found that very inspiring. And so read it and see, do I love this, or do I see it? And can I bring something to it? If the answer is yes, then I read it again and I get out my 3x5 index cards. I outline, like most people do, not up on a board, but on cards that I lay out on a big table. And I outline the book, because I want to see, as going through, every time there's a scene or a division of time or place or chapter or whatever, it's a new card. And I want to see what structure did the author have. And as you do that, and I recommend it as an exercise, if you don't take a book you like and do that to it, you could do it in a day. You see, I see why he did this, and that got her around to that, and you can figure it. You can figure it a little, and it's funny. I thought we'd seen that character sooner, but no, it's been 80 pages, and you sort of, the mystery of how they structured their story falls away a little bit, and you can see it. Then I start just throwing cards over my shoulder that I know should not be in the movie, or can't, or I don't want to, or it's too hard. Sometimes then I have to go dig it out because it's too hard, but it's got to be in the movie. And then you see, and you say, well, is that a movie structure? And the answer is almost always no. So now I start to think, what are the pieces of interstitial material that I would need to get me from this, which I know I want, to this, which I know I want? And then, is it too long? Do I need to combine these characters? But it's all sort of standing over 3x5 cards. And then I read it a third time, if I feel like I have an outline I like. And this time with a pen. This is a very prosaic answer, but, I work with office products. I copy the book and put it in like a 3-ring binder so that I can highlight things and dog-ear things that are like snippets of dialogue or little turns that I know I want in the thing. And after 3 reads, I'm pretty much done with the book. It now must become a movie. So then I carry on from there.
Now, in this case, did you have any restrictions on, because special text technology you mentioned wasn't really set yet, did you have any restrictions on we can't do that, or did Steven say, or write it and we'll figure it out later?
No, I asked him that very question. And I said, what are the limitations that I have, because of effects and dinosaurs and stuff? And he said, the only limitation is your imagination, which I took as somewhat hostile. But also inspiring, thanks, Dad, kind of way. And so I went and I said, okay, and I wrote things that I didn't know if they were possible or not. Now, in many cases, he had storyboarded sequences he wanted. He didn't quite know who would be in the sequence or what but there's certainly the T-Rex attack on the road was always going to be a centerpiece of the movie. That was apparent from anybody reading the book. So, I was working with those a little bit, and therefore I figured he wasn't suggesting any shots that he didn't think were possible. But in fact, he was, because it was all a big gamble. That technology did not exist. The initial plan was to do maybe stop motion, but a lot of robotics. And there is a lot of Stan Winston's brilliant robotic work in the movie. If you don't see the legs of the creature, they're probably puppets. If you see the legs, they're certainly CG. And I remember one day in prep, there was an effects test they were screening at Amblin, and they said, come look at the effects test. And it was a velociraptor skeleton running in place. And no musculature or skin or anything, just the skeleton running in place. And they started it, and everybody gasped because that's going to work. But there was no reason to think it would work because it never had. The biggest effects, CG was born about a year before that with Terminator 2. But those were very melty, weird effects, not trying to create an animal. So it was one of the reasons it was so enthralling as a movie is we'd just never seen anything like it.
Well, then we'll take the original scene where we have our characters first see the dinosaurs, the emotional impact of it, and I even found Ian Malcolm the most doubting of them all, being wowed and blown away. How did you feel that played out the first time you saw that, in the room where they finally see the Brachiosaurus?
Oh, it's spectacular! It's just great. It's not just that there's a great big thing that might be scary. It's majestic. It's beautiful, and that sort of capacity for awe and wonderment is really Steven's magic dust. I don't know how he does that, but he does it over and over and over again, and that was I was quite wowed by that.
I was actually wowed by the scene where Malcolm and Hammond were just debating the science.
Wow, yeah, that's more fun.
Well, it is more fun because
because
Hammond is not. It's not so great. It is great because Hammond's like, I can restore extinct animals that we're killing now, like the condor. So I felt that was kind of interesting. How did you approach that? Because you wanted to make it seem like a little more of a complex conversation.
Yeah, because it is, and you want to always give. You want to give people when there's an argument in a piece of drama, you've got to be able to create a good argument for each side. You have to let everybody be able to defend themselves, even if it's the hero debating a stone villain. The villain's got to have a pretty good point if you want your scene to jump a little. So I needed both of them to be able to make decent points. Malcolm, of course, makes better points, but somebody's got to wear black.
Yeah, because you also that sequence, Alan is still playing the scientist, though. Like he sees a baby raptor, and it was kind of interesting because Alan's still taking the approach trying to figure out the science of it, where Ian was just like, this is going to end terribly.
Yeah. Which no one has listened to him on 9 movies later. They just don't listen.
Yes. Okay. Well, the kids actually I found very interesting. From observing your work on this and War of the Worlds with Steven Spielberg, you don't seem to mind putting kids in mortal danger. But I found that interesting. Tim and Lexi are complex kids. Timmy challenges Alan in his book. They're smart. Lexi's a computer whiz. Still, they both see a dad figure in Alan. How did you approach them to kind of make them very dimensional, make them kids, but also make them interesting to watch?
Well, is with all the characters in a movie where there are dinosaurs are very difficult to write. These movies are quite spectacular for the director and the effects people, and they're a little bit less so for the actors and the writers, I feel. Because we have to work even harder because we're competing. If the characters come out and talk about their parents' divorce too much, you really want them to shut up and go out and look at where the dinosaurs are. As one of my sons said when he was 5 years old, he was watching a movie that was boring, and we were in a big theater, and he stood up and shouted, "Just go where the bad guys are," which I thought was one of the best writing notes I'd ever heard. I try to keep it in mind to this day. So it's hard to write human characters that can compete with the level of fantasy that you have. So you also have to make sure they're in the same movie. The level of fantasy is quite high in this movie, so the characters have to be and feel pretty real, but they can't come from, a piece of 70s realist cinema and be plopped down in this 90s effects movie. They have to sort of exist on the same plane. Doesn't really answer your question.
Well, it's time to talk about the T-Rex scene. We've waited 20 minutes, and the movie we waited an hour and 2 minutes. Like the 1950s monster movies, as well as Spielberg's Duel and Jaws I referenced, Jurassic Park hides the monster at least halfway through the movie. How did hiding that for you as a writer build the tension for this sequence?
Well, again, he sort of made that famous in Jaws, and it came from, it had been written and spoken about so much that I was aware that that's a pretty good idea to keep, to suggest as much as you possibly can and keep it off screen as much as you can. Born of technical necessity on Jaws, and then just was, or maybe not, maybe that was his design. But it's great because that's where your imagination goes, is what are some ways that we can think of to suggest this without seeing it? The cow being lowered into the raptor pen and seeing stuff flying around, the guy going into the box in the beginning. You can suggest a great deal of violence without seeing it and just glimpsing it. The goat we have great fun with because we say, oh, there's a goat and there's a no-show and the goat lays down and that's very disappointing. Then the goat's there and then the goat's gone and then there's a goat leg and there's a lot of good goat stuff. So what that does is it builds a bigger and bigger desire to see for the creature to make its entrance, so that then it better have a good entrance. And I was just saying to you before that I came in the middle and I saw the raptors in the kitchen scene, but this also applies to the T-Rex attack on the road. It's just some of the best film directing I've ever seen. There's the economy of the shots, and it's stunning to look at. So I'm just admiring it as you are. He held off so long, but crucially, when it showed up, it wasn't a letdown. It really had a good entrance, and it looked terrific.
Yeah, it's one thing you mentioned, the Spielberg economy shots. I'm always struck by more the scenes based in realism, like Timmy stuck in the tree. Felt like the more terrifying in some ways than the T-Rex, and because it just feels like it's something that could happen, and we can feel the kid. So that's something for writing that you look at it that way? Do you kind of approach it differently or something like that?
Looking for ways to put your characters in peril that don't involve the dinosaurs is very important. And I think a lot of the good stuff comes from that, because you need that. You need to have that stuff too, and you can't. Otherwise, it becomes a CG fest. And I think that later films, now CG is so accessible and affordable, mostly affordable. Good CG is still pretty pricey. Not good CG is very easy to get. You can get lazy and then your thing looks bad because you're relying on it too much. It's a tool. It can't be the means of expressing your story. So anything that's a practical natural effect is still always going to be better, particularly at suspense than a CG effect. CG effects are great for spectacle.
But also from character, I thought it was interesting because Alan was behaving like a dad. A kid was terrified, threw up, and embarrassed. I thought it was actually kind of a sweet little moment to kind of pull us away from the dinosaurs and kind of ground us a little more.
It's true.
And of course, I'm also one of the other scenes that struck. We're talking. I usually do an experiment with my students, like, what are your scenes that stand out to you? And a lot of them jumped on the Ellie Hammond scene, just having the ice cream, the fear of losing their family and their loved ones. Again, debating the whole science versus that. What was that scene for you?
That was the most rewritten scene in the movie. There's one in every movie where you just can't seem to finish it to everyone's satisfaction. You keep getting called back for more. And the ice cream scene was the one that I rewrote 27 times. And in the end, they usually end up not that long, the scenes, but hopefully you get at a few truthful things.
Well, it's really a turning point, because in the book, as people read the book, his fate is a lot worse than, that actually changes him a little to accept the reality. Also, a little other change, Ian Malcolm dies in the book. Sort of.
No, he does.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
He certainly does. He was just too fun. We didn't want to kill him. Our body count was a lot lighter than we killed. Cheap shot. We killed the lawyer instead on a toilet. So it just the tone of the movie is lighter than that of the book.
And you did kill Newman from Seinfeld, so.
Well, he had it coming.
That's not dream. Okay, so I have to ask about the classic Jeff Goldblum line: "When the Pirates of the Caribbean ride breaks, the pirates don't eat the tourist." Where did the origin come from that?
A meeting with me and Steven, and I can't remember if I said it or he did. How's that for an unsatisfying answer? I'm going to say he did. But that's just because I'm on tape and I don't want it to get back to him, and then he says that was my line.
Yeah.
It's probably me.
All right, so we also notice the pacing picks up now.
I can tell you about Hold On to Your Butts. I do enjoy that. Because I saw someone wearing a shirt in the front that says "Hold On."
Oh, really?
Really, very quickly. So we were doing reshoots on "Death Becomes Her," which is an ending that didn't work, and we'd done the reshoots, and the movie was coming out in about 6 weeks. So we were looking at the dailies, and the director was anxious, hopeful that the reshoots would work. And so as the lights went down in the dailies, Zemeckis, who was directing it, said, "All right, hold on to your butts." And so I went back to my office and wrote it in the script that day. Anyway, so you keep a notebook is my point, because people say funny stuff, and if you can use it,
How's it going? So the pacing does pick up at this point. We had the first movie was a lot of setup. We got the dinosaurs, and now we're kind of running for the second half of the movie. Starting with I thought the great sequence where Timmy's on the fence and Laura Dern's flipping the switch. Was that always how you originally imagined that kind of sequence and the tension, the pacing?
Yeah, I mean, D.W. Griffith would be very happy with that sequence, I think. You can hear the film students in the audience. Yeah. Who famously invented cross-cutting to create tension in cinema. The sequence works very well because there's peril going on in a couple different places. And my favorite moment is one that steps out of just subjective or objective filmmaking. When she's turning the power on to the various things, we're going down with her, so the camera move is motivated, but then the film skims ahead and shows you that the perimeter fences are coming. That's now subjective filmmaking, but it's totally effective because it's just a countdown. It says, look, she's here, There's about 6 to go, and then you cut back to the other thing. I think it's a really brilliantly structured sequence. I'm just saying a lot of things about how brilliant it is. And whatever. You're leading.
You wrote it though, so it's like.
Yeah, okay. But he directed it. But you're leading me there, so I have no choice.
Well, I also found it interesting, like we talked about, you mentioned earlier, setup and payoff. Muldoon dies exactly how the Raptors were described, but Ellie's the only one that survives it. Arnold and Ellie.
Yeah.
I mean, Arnold and 3 of them.
Yes, that's the setup. The setup from the earlier part is exactly as he said. It occurred to me as I was watching it this time, if he had, instead of pausing to say "clever girl," if he'd perhaps swung the barrel of his gun around, he might have been around for the Lost World.
But also, I thought the setup was brilliant because even the first early shot of the movie, you saw the raptor's eyes when it attacked the worker, and you saw intelligence there. That was really a good setup.
Yes.
Where the T-Rex just seemed more of, an animal and scary.
You also see a lot of there was a rule that no one was allowed to refer to them as monsters. They were animals, and they were doing what animals do. And there's a lot of very interesting juxtapositions that remind us of that. In that very sequence, you see the raptor's eye, and you see a snake, a reptile, moving through the foreground. Later in the control room, you see the velociraptor, crowing or whatever it's doing, and its DNA code is being projected on it because from some display. There's a lot of that kind of directorial flourishes that I think really mean a lot.
Again, talking to my students, where they all land on the scariest scene in the world is raptors trapping Timmy and Lexi in the kitchen. How far did you want to push the danger to the kids? What was limitations on that? Why would you think it was?
There's no limit to how much peril you can put a kid in. It's so effective. I asked a friend of mine writes Disney stuff. Used to write Disney movies, and I said, why do you guys always kill a parent? Like always, you're always like 10 minutes in, there's a dead parent. And he said, "'Cause those little bastards are squirrely. You got to get their attention. Grab them by the throat and hold on to them." And you have to. You gotta put people through it. And suggesting that I think the movie makes a silent pact. You go to this movie, the kids aren't going to get eaten or dismembered even. But so you kind of know you're okay. But it's very elemental. Stephen King has a great passage, which I can't quote because it's too long, but in Salem's Lot, he talks about how there is a capacity to be terrified that we have as a child that we lose as an adult. But the kids are right. And that fear is really, primordial. And I think when you're seeing a kid be menaced in a movie, it's more scary not just because they're young and vulnerable and we're meant to protect them, but because we know how terrifying it is for them and we remember that. That conviction that something's going to get you between your bed and the light switch, that doesn't leave us, I don't think.
And when you were writing it, did you have storyboards first? Did you imagine it first and then Steven took over? How did that sequence?
That particular sequence, he had the boards. And I came in and was the lucky recipient of a great sequence, which I then wrote up. I would love to take credit for that. No, Steven, I said, the kitchen. But it wasn't.
You fought him on it. He didn't want to do it. And,
fine, let me do it. But it wasn't like that. No, I think, was it in the book? I don't remember. Or is that something Steven made up?
I think something Steven made up, if I'm not mistaken.
Gosh, he's good.
He is pretty good. Yeah. Remember, the book had a different thing where they went to count eggs as the climax. Remember the whole after they got the park back.
I had forgotten about that. No wonder we changed it.
I found also the sequence with obviously the raptors getting past the technology was really fascinating. Was there something you were conscious, like you wanted the whole movie where the technology was constantly failing the humans, was kind of give the animals more of a...
Yeah, technology must fail us because if the story, it's all, it's got to be fruit of the same tree, and if it's a Prometheus story, which Frankenstein, Prometheus flew too close to the sun. No, he didn't. He stole fire from the gods. I'm thinking of Icarus, but still, Prometheus is the story. and Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, and the idea is you're defying nature. You're doing things wrong, and it's going to lead to ruin. And the humans in it must be failed by technology. And I liked that the animals are. They were. We talk about how clever they are so much that I had this idea that one of my favorite cuts in the movie is unless they figured out how to open doors, and you go to them learning how to open door. And if we've set that up correctly, that will play fine. If we haven't set it up correctly, it'll get a big laugh and people will walk out. But we've talked about how smart they are for so long that I think it works well.
I do have a recommendation if you can pass along to Steven. No need to go back and fix the special effects. They're amazing. But he's got to fix that computer effect with the slow 3.5-inch drive and the lagging, trying to get the menus. No one's going to know what that is a few years from now.
But that's what it was like.
I know. It was just funny watching it today. I was like, oh my God, like clicking the menus.
It looked pretty cutting edge at the time.
All right, so we have the climax. Did you always land on the T-Rex coming back and, the raptors?
That was during shooting. The way it was originally scripted, which I can't remember if it's in the book or not, is Hammond. It felt important that Hammond must destroy the raptors because that's the completion of his character arc. And in the classic sort of, Michael Corleone model of character change, he has to go from this to that. And so from having created these things, and I've been present at the birth of everyone, it seemed to make thematic sense that he's the one who kills the raptors and saves the day. But over the course of shooting, the T-Rex was working so well and was such a dominant presence in the movie that it seemed crazy not to have it come back. So that was a change during shooting.
Okay. Now, obviously, they escaped the island, but the original book ended with the island being destroyed, our heroes being locked up. Was there any impetus for doing that, or you just wanted to leave it open for a sequel?
No thought of a sequel, but do you want to have them locked up at the end of the story? It just, again, movies and books are different. It's a cool ending of a book. It's not the right ending of a summer fantasy movie. It didn't seem to us.
Now, we have a couple questions about Lost World, which also did. What was the challenge or the fun of being able to expand Ian Malcolm's character? Because he is a supporting character in the original, and you got to really kind of go deeper into his character.
Yes, that movie was very, very hard. Sequels are brutally difficult. I think that the movie world is doing better with them now when they're serial adventures. I think that comic book movies do well with sequels because they have sometimes 50, 60 years of material and storylines to draw from, and they know where they're going and they can set things up, and then you go there and it's just a continuation of the story. But this was a survival story. This was, will things go wrong at the island and can the people escape? So to do it again, it's hard to continue the story. You're kind of just repeating the story. So I found that script much harder to write than the first one because to continue the story, you got to have them get to the mainland. That didn't seem, well, we did eventually do that. It was difficult because to get anybody to go back, you have to overcome why on earth would they do that? Because we know now what can happen. So I found that really hard.
I found it interesting that the movie...
I complain a lot about how things are hard. That you can imagine how my wife feels.
But actually, I liked it because of the ecological thing. Like, they're trying to go back and, preserve the island, which I found fascinating.
Yes. Good. I'm glad.
But in some ways, you did have the great King Kong ending where you get to Act 3, get him off the island.
Well, that was fun. I thought it regained some spirit of fun in that. And obviously, the boat... that crashes into the dock is called the Venture, which was the boat in King Kong. So we were saying, look, we know we're doing that. And then I thought that was some of the loosest filmmaking of that, the storytelling of that movie.
Obviously, we got to enjoy Jurassic Park. Did you imagine 29 years later that the film would still be so impactful?
No, I mean, who would? I remember I had. Brian De Palma had just directed Carlito's Way, a script I wrote the year before that, and we were friends and have been friends since. And Brian's great, a very funny and fatalistic guy. And we went out to dinner, and in the lead up to Jurassic Park, and he said, "There's only one question about that movie. Will it make $200 million, or will it ruin everyone's career?" And thankfully, it was the former. But it was going to be kind of disastrous, or it was going to be, a great success. But he didn't have any idea which. So no, I didn't imagine.
We're going to ask about one piece of work, then we're going to open up to the audience, so get your questions ready. I can see you're excited. So. It is the 20th anniversary of Spider-Man.
Oh,
the Tobey Maguire version. And they just, yeah. You mentioned earlier that we have a book, but in the case of Spider-Man, you had comic books and years of history.
Yes.
Was it a different approach adapting that and bringing that to life? Because just to put it in context, superhero genre was non-existent at that time.
It was going through a dark, fallow period. The last time it had worked was Burton's Batman movies, which were the mid-'80s, late 80s. And it hadn't worked for 10 years. And there have been a lot of bad ones, and cheap ones. And Columbia's the exciting thing was Jim Cameron had written a treatment for Spider-Man, and then there was a bunch of litigation and companies went bankrupt and things happened. But the fact that he took it seriously, I think, made a lot of people think, oh wait, you can take this seriously. Cameron did. So Columbia was willing to spend a lot of money and make a big, serious movie with A-list filmmakers and actors, and they really were willing to go for it. So it was, I went and I had been a fan of Spider-Man growing up, and mostly the animated TV show. And I just went back and read as many of the comics as I could in one go, and found the storyline that I liked, which was Peter, MJ, Harry, which was, a triangle is the most stable plane in geometry, and it's also something great to build a story on. And that triangle worked great. And the fact that one member of the triangle's dad was going to be the villain, and that guy didn't know, it was all very, melodramatic and effective.
How did you react to your story coming back to life in the new Spider-Man movie?
Well, it's not really mine. We get to work on these things for a while, but it had been a part of the culture for a long time. So I did my version, and then it was fun. I found it kind of moving when Tobey's character came back, because he's older, and you can see the living in his face and in his eyes. And I thought he played it. I thought that was really kind of touching.
Cool.
Hello?
Oh, hi.
Hi, I had a prepared question. Your films like Jurassic Park, War of the Worlds, and Panic Room all take place over short periods of time. How does confining the time frame help you as a screenwriter?
That's my favorite question. I call it a bottle. I said earlier the world is too big, and it is. Anybody who sat in front of a typewriter or blank screen to try to tell a story, or blank pad to try to tell a story, knows, well, God in heaven, where do I start? And what will contain this story? And movies in particular rely on structure heavily to tell their story in ways that books don't have to. Books can digress. 200 pages, 500 pages, whatever you want. Movies are different. People expect, a certain length. They expect a certain beginning, middle, endness. And finding a structure that confines you is actually, to me, much more useful than any idea. You mentioned Panic Room. That came because I lived in a house like that. Not that big, but I lived in a house like that. And the house was 120 years old, and it was falling apart, and we had to remodel it, and nothing worked, and it was, I hated the house, and I thought, this house is killing me. I'm going to write a story in it, to get even almost. So the rules I set for myself were, I get 5 characters, 2 protagonists, 3 villains, and I cannot leave the house. How can I tell a story? And the story is vertical, because it's a townhouse. And within that, I found myself having lots of ideas. If I'm confined to something, I can get ideas. It's like, if you learned about the Hays Code, You know, in the 20s and 30s, movies were pretty ribald, and the public was starting to get not happy about it. And so it was a self-censorship thing. You can't have sex, you can't have, you know, a number of things. So clever writers and directors said, well, how can we suggest things that are really, you know, dirty or saucy without, and still operate within the code? And they ended up having stuff that was much more, you know, suggestive than it had been before because they were contained a little. So I find the bottle for my story, whether it's 24 hours, is a great bottle. 1 week, 3 days when they must get off this island. You know, those limitations, and War of the Worlds, again, another bottle. I said, we've seen a lot of these alien invasion movies. Let's contain this, only this character's point of view. Let's see, never cut to a foreign capital. Don't cut to a general pushing things around on a map. None of that. Just what the main character sees and does. That's all we get to see. And within that constraint, Steven then was able to extrapolate ways that made it even scarier, because a limited point of view is scarier than a global point of view. So I recommend finding that bottle to tell your story in, because it makes it all manageable.
Big thank you from my mom first. She used to put this on for me at Jurassic Park every day when I was growing up. So you bought her a few hours. Anyway, my question is actually about the second movie, because I don't think anyone's mentioned it, but you have a little cameo in that movie near the end. You're eaten by the T-Rex. So I was wondering, were you like jealous that you weren't in the first movie? Like, did you want to get killed? I don't know. Whose idea was to have you be killed?
That was my idea. I cast myself. I was turning in a rewrite, and I said, there's a person in here that I wrote that I would like to play. And Steven said, can you act? And I said, sure I can. And I just thought it would be a lot of fun, because all he has to do is run down the street and scream and, you know, get eaten. And so it was something I really wanted to do. Then he, and it worked out fine. And then he offered me a part in Saving Private Ryan as a guy, and I said, sure, let me read it. And I read it, and a guy has, this time, a couple lines. He says, you know, well, he's running down the ammunition they have. And then he steps outside a tent and gets shot in the head and dies. And Tom Sizemore drags his corpse around for a while. And I was like, this is no, I'm not going to, no. I wasn't making a career out of being chum for your movies. But anyway, yeah, it was a lot of fun. I did gain a lot of respect for what actors do. I think anybody who wants to write or direct should go play a tiny part in a movie if they can, because you realize that it's you. And that I showed up the first night, and they gave me my wardrobe, and I put it on, and I went and complained. I said, Steven, I'm sorry, but I would never wear this, and I think it makes me look fat, and I can't run in these shoes. And he just went, you too? But you realize, oh, it's me. It's different from, here's my work, go do it. It's me, and I'm gonna look stupid or fat or say the dumb thing. And I have a lot of empathy for actors as a result of that.
How did you get the idea to write the second movie, the second Jurassic Park movie?
I'd like to apologize for any salty language I used earlier. I need to check the crowd a little more carefully. How did I get to write it? Well, the first one had gone well. And I had maintained good relationships with my coworkers, which is very important. You got to be somebody that people want to work with. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them all the time, but it does mean that when you disagree with them, you're respectful. And so when the opportunity came around for another job, I think the director and the studio felt like he works hard and he's respectful. So let's give him another chance. So I got the job. So a lot of the things you're learning in school right now about how to get along with the people you're with really are important, because they help you in the work world too.
So in the first movie here, we had Lewis Dotson paying Nedry to get the dinosaurs off the island, and then in the second book, he reappears, but goes to the island himself to take the dinosaurs off to get what he wanted in the first place. But in the second film, he was completely written out, and we had the new character of Hammond's nephew taking over and extracting the dinosaurs. What was the idea behind making that switch?
There was a lot of, in the couple years since the first movie, Steven had a lot of ideas. I'm sorry, I was leaning right into that. Steven had a lot of ideas. I'd had a lot of ideas, and then Crichton said, "Well, I'm going to write a book." So he wrote a book, but our ideas didn't stop. So I think that at that point, you had several people who felt like a second movie was going to be kind of their thing, and I always feel like we're free to depart from a book in any way we choose, because I don't. When people say, "Oh, they ruined that book," when someone makes a movie and they feel like it didn't live up to the book, I always say they did not. The book is still there. You can go buy it right now. We didn't burn the book. You're in a very different medium, so you're making a brand new thing. I think also the idea of creating a brand new character suggests that you can cast anybody you want, and you can make it any kind of character that you want whatsoever. So I think we just had a lot of ideas already when by the time the book was done.
All right, well, we end our Q&As with the same question. We have, like we mentioned to you before, we have a lot of screenwriting students in the audience. What would a screenplay would you assign them to read, to study? There's a number. I can tell you the ones that I read that were really formative for me, and they're both by the same writer. No, I'll just tell you one of his and one of somebody else's. Now, this was the early 80s, so, you gotta... But Larry Kasdan's script for Body Heat is just a screenwriting masterpiece. It's just fantastic. And I'm sure you can get it online. I remember the first line in it is "flames in the night sky," which is not a sentence. It has no verb. But that sums up the whole movie. It's flames, heat, fire, sexual energy, night, mysterious danger. It's everything in 5 words. So I learned a lot. Also, he has a good, clear, terse style that I really liked. At that same time, I read Chris Columbus's script for Gremlins, which was also really quite good. For a completely different style, I'm a fan of terse writing, and I won't be so solipsistic as to say, well, read my Panic Room script. But if you did read my Panic Room script, I like terse. That's because I think you're trying to get a reader to push their eyes across the page at the roughly the pace that they would watch a movie. Reading a screenplay is really difficult. You are called upon. It's not like a book where everything's spelled out for you. You are called upon to imagine visuals and sound really clearly in your mind. So you have to read with a certain amount of concentration and participation. And I think when you get big, chunky, descriptive paragraphs, you're killing a reader. You're making it too hard. And obviously, I don't like things that are hard. But you have to keep them moving. So those scripts have terse styles that I like and emulated. However, many writers feel differently than I do. And if you want to read, if you are given to longer descriptions and you like that, a brilliant use of that is Andy Walker's script for Seven. I'm sure that's also online. But Andrew Kevin Walker writes much more fully than I do. And it holds you, because he's brilliant. But it's just not my style, it's his. Well, the last 2 years has been very difficult, and we missed being in a movie theater together. So I can't tell you how excited and happy we were that you let us come back together with Jurassic Park and join us today to share your insights.
Well, thank you.
Thank you
It's a pleasure
so
to be
much.
here. Thanks.